For most soldiers in World War II, capture meant survival, a chance to live, even if it was behind barbed wire. But for the men of Hitler's Waffen-SS, surrender was never the end. It was a death sentence. On the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, when the feared soldiers of the Third Reich fell into Soviet hands, there were no prison camps, no Red Cross visits, only vengeance. The Red Army had seen their villages burned, their families slaughtered, their comrades executed without mercy, and so, when the tables turned, the judgment came swiftly, without a courtroom, without a trial, only blood for blood. This is the untold story of what happened when the hunters became the hunted, when the most feared soldiers in Europe faced the fury of the East. The war on the Eastern Front wasn't just another campaign, it was hell, built by human hands. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, he didn't see it as a fight for territory or resources. He called it a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. This wasn't about borders, it was about ideology, Nazism against communism, a crusade to erase an entire system, an entire people, from the map. From the very first day, the rules of war were gone. The Geneva Convention? Torn apart. Civilians were no longer bystanders, they were targets. Entire villages burned, prisoners executed in ditches, families starved behind barbed wire. And though both sides committed atrocities, it was the German invasion that opened the gates of organized cruelty. Behind every advancing tank column followed the death squads, methodical, relentless, efficient. They called it cleansing operations. History remembers it as genocide. The Eastern Front wasn't a battlefield, it was a graveyard stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where millions vanished beneath the snow and mercy itself froze to death. At the very center of this storm stood the Schutzstaffel, the SS. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, they were the ideological sword of the Third Reich, sworn not to Germany, but to Hitler himself. The men in black uniforms were more than an army. They were a cult, trained to obey without question, to kill without hesitation, and to believe without doubt. The Waffen-SS, the combat arm of the organization, became one of the most feared forces on the Eastern Front. They fought in every major battle, from the gates of Leningrad to the ruins of Stalingrad, earning a reputation for discipline, fanaticism, and unimaginable cruelty. But their mission went far beyond combat. Wherever the Waffen-SS marched, terror followed. Behind their lines came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units tasked with cleansing towns and villages. Their rifles didn't aim at soldiers. They aimed at families, at the old, the sick, the unarmed. To the Red Army, these weren't ordinary enemies. They were symbols of everything evil that had descended on their land, the executioners of their people, the faces of genocide. And when the tide of war finally turned, that black uniform, once a badge of pride, became a death warrant. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the SS weren't just another enemy. They were the enemy, the walking embodiment of fascism, the men who had burned their homes, executed their families, and turned their land into a graveyard. To them, those black uniforms weren't symbols of strength. They were ghosts of slaughter, reminders of every village erased, every comrade lost. This hatred wasn't just emotional, it was official. The Soviet state had made it clear, the SS were not soldiers. They were war criminals by definition, stripped of every protection under the Geneva Convention. A captured Wehrmacht soldier might face the long, frozen years of a prison camp. But for an SS man, the outcome was far more personal and far more final. The Red Army needed no trial to pass judgment. A glimpse of the SS runes on a collar, a blood group tattoo burned into the skin. That was enough. The sentence was immediate, and the hatred ran deep, fueled by years of brutality carried out by divisions like Totenkopf and Das Reich, infamous for their massacres and scorched earth campaigns. So when the Soviet tide turned and the Red Army pushed west, they weren't marching as conquerors, they were coming as avengers. And for the men of the SS, there would be no mercy, no forgiveness, only reckoning. So, why this level of hatred? To understand the fate that awaited captured SS men, you have to look at what they actually did on Soviet soil. The trail the Waffen-SS left across the east was one of fire and blood. They weren't just going along with the horrors of the Nazi regime, they were often the ones designing them. From the first days of Operation Barbarossa, SS units operated with a cruelty that shocked even some regular German commanders. They were deeply involved in the Holocaust, with special SS and police units called Einsatzgruppen tasked with murdering entire Jewish communities. These mobile killing squads followed the main army, rounding up and executing hundreds of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. But the atrocities didn't stop there. Waffen-SS divisions were directly involved in what they called anti-partisan operations. In reality, these were just campaigns of terror against civilians. Entire villages were wiped out if they were even suspected of helping partisans. The 1st SS Cavalry Regiment, for instance, reported killing over 3,000 Jews and partisans by early August 1941. Just a few weeks later, that same unit had murdered an estimated 11,000 Jews and hundreds of captured Red Army soldiers. These weren't rogue actions, this was policy. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war was just as horrific. Nazi ideology saw Slavic peoples as Untermenschen or subhumans, and their captured soldiers were treated that way. Of the nearly 6 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans, it's estimated that 3 million died from starvation, exposure, disease, and summary execution. They were packed into open-air camps with no shelter, deliberately starved, and shot if they were too weak to stand. In camps like Gross-Rosen, the SS killed over 65,000 Soviet POWs by feeding them nothing but a thin soup of grass and water for 6 months. At Mauthausen, so many were shot that their blood contaminated the local water supply. On top of this, sexual violence against Soviet women was widespread. This was the world the Red Army soldier lived in. For him, the war was the memory of his burning home, the stories of murdered neighbors, and the sight of mass graves in every town they liberated. Soviet propaganda posters that screamed, "Kill the German," were just reflecting a deep, personal rage. Soldiers were told that the authorities wouldn't punish, and sometimes even encouraged, brutality against their German captors. It wasn't seen as a war crime, it was a service to the motherland. So when a Soviet soldier finally stood over a surrendered SS man, he wasn't just looking at a defeated enemy. He was looking at the man he held personally responsible for destroying his world. And in that moment, justice was swift. By the final year of the war, the German war machine was falling apart. On the Eastern Front, massive Soviet offensives were shattering German lines and surrounding entire armies. In the fields of Ukraine, the streets of Budapest, and the rubble of Berlin, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were captured. For the men of the Waffen-SS, who were ordered to fight to the last man, surrender was often a chaotic, desperate act. In northern Berlin, soldiers of the 11th SS Nordland Division fought until they were out of ammo. Many only gave up after their commanders were killed, and even then, they tried to break out and surrender to the Americans in the West because they were so terrified of the Soviets. For many, surrendering to the Red Army wasn't a choice. It was just what happened when they were surrounded and exhausted. An SS junior officer from the Das Reich division, captured near Brno, supposedly told his interrogator, "I knew when I put on the cuff title this would be the price." The Soviets made it a top priority to find the SS men among the prisoners. Upon capture, prisoners were searched immediately, and often violently. The easiest giveaway was the uniform, the collar tabs with the SS runes, the cuff titles with the division's name, or the death's head insignia. Knowing this, many SS men frantically tried to ditch their uniforms, swap them with Wehrmacht soldiers, or burn their paybooks. But the one thing they couldn't get rid of was often hidden on their own bodies. A large number of SS members, especially those who joined before 1943, had their blood type tattooed on the inside of their left arm. It was originally meant to help with blood transfusions on the battlefield, but for a captured SS man, it became an undeniable mark of guilt. Soviet soldiers quickly learned to look for it. The command, "sleeves up," was often a death sentence. Those discovered with the tattoo were immediately pulled from the lines of regular Wehrmacht prisoners. The sorting process was brutally efficient. Prisoners were marched to temporary holding areas where armed guards and NKVD officers separated them. Those with SS insignia or the blood type tattoo were shoved into a separate group. Their journey into captivity was going to be very different. They were no longer just prisoners of war, they were a special category, marked for special treatment. The fear was real. As they were pushed aside, they knew they were facing a judgment from which there was probably no escape. For many captured SS men, the journey to a POW camp never even began. The battlefield itself became their execution ground. In the raw, hate-filled moments after a firefight, with the smell of gunpowder in the air and the bodies of friends lying nearby, there was no mercy to be found. Summary executions of SS prisoners weren't rare incidents. They were a widespread and brutal part of the war on the Eastern Front. Soviet frontline troops, hardened by years of brutal warfare and burning with a desire for revenge, often took matters into their own hands. An SS soldier identified by his uniform or tattoo was frequently shot on the spot. There are countless accounts of small groups of SS prisoners being led behind a building or into a ditch, followed by the sound of machine gun fire. These acts were often spontaneous, a furious response to discovering a German atrocity nearby, or just the culmination of 4 years of rage. Soviet authorities largely turned a blind eye to these killings, and sometimes even encouraged them. It wasn't seen as a war crime, but as a righteous cleansing of fascist pigs. The methods were as varied as they were brutal. Beatings with rifle butts were common. Some captives were simply strangled. Public humiliation was also a tool. During the final days of the Battle of Berlin, SS members caught hiding among civilians were dragged into the streets. One account describes a woman being forced to strip to reveal an SS tattoo, then tied to a lamppost and left to an angry crowd before a Soviet soldier shot her. This was justice in its most raw and immediate form. Even if they weren't executed right away, the first moments of capture were terrifying. An SS man could expect to be kicked, spat on, and have everything he owned stripped from him. Any sign of resistance was met with extreme violence. While the Red Army's political leadership did try to limit the killing of prisoners, they were, after all, a source of intelligence, their orders were often ignored in the heat of the moment. For the individual soldier who had seen his country destroyed, he was often the judge, jury, and executioner. This immediate retribution was the first filter. It decided who lived and who died in the first few hours. For those who survived, their ordeal was far from over. They were just being passed on to the next level of Soviet vengeance, the interrogation cells of the NKVD. But what about the ones who weren't executed on the spot? For an SS man who survived the chaos of capture, his journey led him straight into the hands of a different kind of enemy, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. If the frontline soldiers' justice was hot-blooded and immediate, the NKVD's was cold, methodical, and even more terrifying. These captured SS men weren't just prisoners, they were valuable sources of intelligence and political pawns to be exploited and punished. Unlike regular Wehrmacht prisoners who might go to a transit camp, SS personnel were sorted into a special group for interrogation. The Soviets considered them all to be hardcore Nazis and wanted to know everything: unit strengths, command structures, and most importantly, their personal involvement in war crimes. The NKVD, through its Prisoner Administration Agency, GUPVI, had a formal system in place to filter and process them. Interrogation centers were set up quickly in cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Poznan. Here, the treatment was systematically brutal. Confessions were often extracted through torture. Beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological torment were standard. The goal was to gather intelligence and force prisoners to sign confessions, true or not, that would justify their punishment. These were basically show trials where the verdict was decided before they even started. For the Soviets, capturing a high-ranking SS officer or a member of a notorious division was a huge political win. Their interrogations were used to build a narrative of fascist guilt, creating propaganda and evidence for future war crimes trials. The NKVD was ruthless in its hunt for anyone trying to hide their identity, using informants within the prison population to expose them. Those considered especially important, high-ranking officers, specialists, or those suspected of major atrocities, would disappear into the NKVD's massive prison system, and many were never heard from again. Others, after being forced to confess, were sentenced by Soviet military tribunals to long, hard prison terms. But they weren't going to a standard POW camp. They were getting a one-way ticket to the darkest corner of the Soviet Empire. the Gulag. For these men, surviving the battlefield was just the prelude to a slower, more agonizing death in the labor camps of Siberia. For an SS man who survived capture and interrogation, the next chapter was a journey into hell, and it often began with a death march. Since the Soviet military prioritized transport for its own troops, prisoners were often forced to march hundreds of kilometers to the nearest camp or railway. Of the 91,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, nearly two-thirds died between their surrender and their arrival at a camp. Weakened by battle and starvation, wearing torn uniforms in the brutal Russian winter, they staggered through the snow. Food was almost non-existent. Illnesses like dysentery and typhus swept through the columns. Anyone who stumbled or fell behind was often shot by the guards without a second thought. It was a horrifying process of natural selection where only the strongest or luckiest survived. The destination was often a Soviet special camp. After the war, the NKVD set up 10 of these camps in the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany, often repurposing former Nazi concentration camps like Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. These camps held not only SS men and Nazi officials, but also thousands of others who had been arrested for any reason, from being a suspected anti-communist to simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Inmates were often forbidden from working, left to waste away from boredom and starvation. Because they were cut off from the outside world, they became known as Schweigelager, the silence camps. Conditions were catastrophic. Barracks were dangerously overcrowded. During the Winter of Hunger of 1946-47, food rations were cut to almost nothing. At Special Camp No. 7 in Sachsenhausen, 12,000 of the 60,000 inmates died from hunger and disease between 1945 and 1950. At Buchenwald, now NKVD Special Camp No. 2, over 7,000 prisoners died and were dumped in mass graves. Their families were never told. Those who weren't held in the special camps were sent even deeper into the Soviet Union, into the infamous network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. Here, they became part of the slave labor force that Stalin used to rebuild the nation the Nazis had tried to destroy. Sent to the far corners of Siberia or the Caucasus, they faced extreme cold, malnutrition, and backbreaking work in mines and logging operations. The death rate was staggering. During the war years, it peaked at a horrifying 25%. For the vast majority of SS men sent into this frozen abyss, there was no coming back.